Greetings, my fellow Americans, and welcome to another episode of the Great Montana Conspiracy Podcast. I'm your host, Ron Glegg. Tonight we're going to be doing something I normally don't do. We're going to be entering the world of international politics. And it's not going to be a typical, let's attack the corruption of Montana or anything like that. This is going to be over a world event that's very, very frightening, terrorizing, and that is the war in Ukraine. I felt that with everything that's going on, I need to take a break from what I've been talking about and try to hit something that's a little bit closer to home. But before we get started, as always, please hit the like and subscribe button. Share the video with your friends. If you're watching this on YouTube or whatever platform you happen to be using, whatever the equivalent is, the like, subscribe, thumbs up, whatever it is, on the platform you're watching this, please do. Please share, and please tell your friends about it. Share it on Facebook, share it on YouTube, share it wherever you can to try to spread this information that these podcasts have. As I mentioned, tonight we're talking about Ukraine, and we're not talking about Ukraine and that, oh, the influence of Ukraine is coming over to Montana. Nothing like that specifically. It's just, this is one of those large-scale world events that affect us all, and I just felt I needed to take a moment and talk about this in some context so that maybe I can try to bring some sensibility to what otherwise is a senseless affair. It's been predominating my mind, it's been predominating the minds of people around me, and I just think that tonight I just need to take a moment to talk about it and share my thoughts with you and hopefully spread my goodwill to the universe towards the people of Ukraine. As I said, normally I wouldn't discuss world events in my podcasts. Once in a while I might talk about some event that's relative, might be a national event or national history or something to that effect. After all, Montana's authority stems from the U.S. influence. Without the United States Constitution, without the formation of the states, without making Montana a state, obviously the Great Montana Conspiracy would not exist. The power of the state to become independent, to have its own constitution, stems from the United States Constitution. So obviously those are going to be overlapping issues, especially when Montana uses and abuses the structure that was created by the Founding Fathers to self-empower themselves, or the power or the influence of Congress passing block grants or whatever it happens to be. But this episode, I'm going to break that model because it's something that's really, really bad, and it's something that affects us all. And if you don't think it affects you, you aren't a student of history. World War I was started by the assassination of one man. And that assassination led to an allegiance of countries coming together, fighting each other, and we ended up in our First World War. The Second World War was created by the aggressions of a country that started invading its neighbors. And as a consequence, we ended up in our Second World War. And this is an element of both. We're talking about one act in one isolated area, and it's actually the invasion of one country. The invasion of the country itself has sparked a huge problem. I mean, it's, on one hand, if you're trying to take a devil's advocate position, Russia has a historical claim to ruling Ukraine when Russia and Ukraine were both part of the Soviet Union, the United Soviet Socialist Republic. Moscow ruled over it all. With the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, obviously that changed. Ukraine became its own independent country, and Russia has wanted it back ever since. So the idea that Russia has taken this massive step into invading Ukraine, it's sparked a new fear, because it's not just Russia invading Ukraine, it's Vladimir Putin talking about nuclear war. And if you aren't drawing that context from what he's saying, then you really aren't paying attention. And I hope you will pay attention to my words, because this is what is scary. I grew up with this. I grew up in the 70s and 80s, living with the fear of nuclear war, dealing with the big bad Russia who was going to launch nuclear war, nuclear missiles overnight. You know, we were going to, Weird Al Yankovic created one of my favorite songs, Christmas at Ground Zero, because it was a reflection of our times. Growing up with the ever-present fear of nuclear annihilation, of Russia launching nuclear weapons, that went away in '91 with the collapse of the Soviet Union, with the entering of Russia into a more global network communications. We had some fairly decent leaders coming out of Russia. Vladimir Putin is not one of them, obviously. But this very real threat of nuclear war that's stemming from one country, Russia, it's a prospect that is not easily dismissed. When Russia invaded the Ukraine, the world imposed sanctions, as is the modern method to deterring war. And those sanctions are crippling the Russian government. They're crippling the Russian economy. And apparently Vladimir Putin believes in the scorched earth principle. If he cannot have his way, if he cannot have his toys, he'd rather see the world destroyed and obliterated because he can't get his way. It's literally, if I cannot have my toys, I'm going to burn down the factory. That's literally his response. If you help Ukraine, it's an act of war. If you enforce a no-fly zone, it's an act of war. If you do anything that gets in my way, that stop my ambitions and my greed and my invading an independent country, it's an act of war. And by the way, I've raised nuclear alertness to make sure that we're ready with our nuclear weapons. This is what he's doing. This is exactly what he's doing. He's threatening the world with nuclear war because he wants Ukraine and he doesn't want interference from the rest of the world. Now, I would hope that this is all a threat, that this is all posturing, that this is all him saying, I'm going to do this as a deterrent to try to keep people out of his business. But the fear is there. It's a very real concern because he could do it. He would literally be blowing his own country up because obviously the rest of the world will respond in kind. But as I said, he'd rather have the world inherit a scorched earth than him not get his way. It's a very real concern. Historically, Ukraine has been in its current state since the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. The current government has been in place since around 2013. Russia has always sought to reabsorb the Ukraine ever since the Soviet Union fell apart. It's backed several movements, it's backed several dissidents, it's backed several groups declaring independence, the various territories that make up the Ukraine. It even bought the allegiance of a former president of the Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych. Ukrainians rose up in what has been called the Revolution of Dignity in February 2014 against him basically swearing allegiance to Russia. The parliament of the Ukraine had voted to enter a formal treaty with the European Union for trade and support and moving Ukraine closer to NATO admission. And Yanukovych decided he was going to reject it all and enter a separate agreement with Russia. And it was not approved by the parliament. The Ukrainians rose up, they overthrew the government. The parliament voted unanimously to oust their president on February 23rd, 2021. February 23rd, 2014. And Yankovic fled to Russia, and he lives there to this day in exile. He's a war criminal. He's wanted for war crimes in the Ukraine. But Russia harbors him. The Ukrainian people have actually rejected ties with Russia. So much so they rose up in revolution to overthrow the existing government. But it's not stopped Russia from trying to regain Ukraine. In fact, the very next day after Yanukovych was actually after Yanukovych was deposed, they began to move into Crimea, which is a territory that's part of the Ukraine. And there's history, of course. There's, when you talk about countries and territories in both Europe and in Russia and in the Middle East, there's always history. But Crimea was a recognized part of the Ukraine. And the very next day after the president of Ukraine was exiled, or entered his own self-imposed exile because he fled charges of war crimes, Russia responded to overthrow Crimea. The very next day, they began to move forces, organized a rebellion on February 24th, 2014, officially sent special forces on February 27th to seize the Crimean government buildings, and then actually officially annexed the territory to Russian control on March 18th, 2014. This was an aggressive response to an independent country saying, we're not going to ally with you. So they took part of the territory. They then entered into an effort, and an ongoing effort, that's still an ongoing effort, to take another region of the Ukraine, Donbass. But all of this is just a build-up, because in this conflict that's been going on, as Russia's been trying to justify an invasion of Ukraine. The first signs of the full invasion of the country rose in late March, early April of last year, 2021. Ukraine had been moving to join NATO, as I mentioned, which is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, just for anybody who doesn't know what NATO stands for. It represents 30 independent countries who basically have a sworn universal defense agreement. If you attack one of us, you attack all of us. So it's not a wartime alliance, it's not an aggressive alliance, it's not an alliance that says we're going to come together and join forces and take over the world. But it is a defense alliance, and Russia's always been threatened by it. It's always been trying to make propaganda and media and everything else, trying to claim the NATO countries are working against it. They're putting defense shield missile silos. They could be turned over into launching Tomahawk missiles. They could be converted. They could be a threat to us. There's absolutely no indication it's all propaganda. This is what totalitarian governments do. Even though Russia is supposed to be a democracy, Putin has been slowly taking away and eroding the constitutional independence of the country. In fact, when they inherited sanctions, the people of Russia actually rose up in protest. They've been holding protests, and Putin is arresting them. He's shut down the media. The state has ordered that no criticism of Putin or the invasion of Ukraine can be brought in. All this has to be the state-run message. Kind of sounds familiar with what the Great Montana Conspiracy is trying to do here. But this is actually very aggressive and very successful over in Russia. But when Russia started moving troops to the border of Ukraine, of course, the world was concerned. Ukraine was concerned. They were concerned they were going to be invading, making an attempt. And of course, the immediate response was, we're going to sanction you if you try to invade this territory that's not yours. This is an independent country. This is a country that has its own solidarity. You have no business being on their territory. Even though the Ukraine was not part of NATO at that point in time, it still isn't part of NATO, just of note. The idea was the world was going to sit here and not recognize a tyrant. Even though Ukraine was not and is not part of NATO, the world was still responding to an aggressor. When Iraq invaded Kuwait back in the 90s, it was, we're going to sanction Iraq, even though obviously Kuwait was not a part of NATO. Nevertheless, the United Nations still came together and still formed an alliance to liberate Kuwait. And this is basically the response that Russia received to its aggression against Ukraine. Russia claimed that if the Ukraine entered NATO, it represented a security risk, that they could place missile silos within the Ukraine that could then target Moscow. Notably, as I mentioned, NATO is a defense against attack alliance. It's a defense alliance. It's not a war alliance. It's not an alliance of aggressors. And Russia has never been attacked. Never been attacked since the formation of NATO, and NATO's been around since after World War II. It's been around a long time. And yet, they've never been attacked, not a single aggressor, but propagandists are propagandists. And they will continue to tell the story that NATO is a threat. And having countries capable of launching attacks against Mother Russia is a problem. So, when Russia is claiming that there's a threat from Ukraine joining NATO, it's just the ongoing concern, the ongoing issue that Ukraine should not be apart from Russia. Russia should own Ukraine, and it's just an excuse. It's what's called a false flag in many wartime talks. But anyway, Russia withdrew some of its troops in June of last year, made it look like they were going to de-escalate, move away from the invasion, and then started raising them back up again in September. By November, there was over 100,000 troops that were stationed near the border. By the beginning of this year, it was up to 175,000. In both instances, of course, Russia denied any plans to invade Ukraine. We aren't invading Ukraine, it's not there. So we're here for wartime exercises, blah, blah, blah. Rhetoric. But on February 24th, 2022, Russian President Vladimir Putin ordered the invasion of Ukraine. He claimed a reasoning that it was for demilitarizing and denazifying Ukraine. Claimed that the Ukrainian government had been influenced by Nazis. I mean, the Nazis were a 1940s concern, not a 2020 concern. But he can work off of something that people are afraid of. They don't want the rise of Nazism. They don't want the rise of... But ironically enough, Vladimir Putin's organization is far more threatening than even the Nazis were. Because at least the Nazis, you knew what you were facing. They didn't try to really hide what they were. Vladimir Putin seeks to hide from the Russian people what he's trying to do, and therefore there's a little more secrecy. He's very KGB influenced, and therefore has this idea of secrecy and not being as open, and of course outright lying about what he's going to do. So, on February 27th, 2022, Putin placed Russia's nuclear forces on higher alert. He made the announcement that he had specifically directed the deterrence forces to put on special regime of combat duty, which basically meant, essentially, he was telling the nuclear weapons, people who were operating nuclear weapons, to be ready, to stand by and be ready. In essence, Putin has threatened to use nuclear weapons to launch a nuclear war. Without a specific target. I mean, Ukraine obviously is not a nuclear power, therefore why obliterate Ukraine with nuclear weapons? Okay, that's obviously not his target. Because then on March 5th, Putin declared the international sanctions were an act of war. In effect, Putin has said that anyone penalizing Russia or aiding Ukraine is an enemy. He says basically that anyone enforcing the no-fly zone over the Ukraine by Russia would be considered entering the war, entering the conflict. Now, you draw these two parallels together. On one hand, a week earlier, he said he was readying the nuclear arsenal. Now he's declaring that anybody who helps or gets involved, even if it's in the form of sanctions, even if it's the form of maintaining a no-fly zone over an independent territory not his own, it was an act of war. He is threatening to use nuclear weapons against anyone who helps Ukraine. And that is a threat of nuclear war. Because, of course, if he uses nuclear weapons, the rest of the world will use nuclear weapons, and we're going to have a massive launch all across the world. It's over. That's all she wrote. If Russia launches one nuclear missile someone, whether it be the United States, or it be China, or it be European Union, will launch a retaliatory strike. They see one nuclear missile in the air, there will be a retaliatory strike. And then Russia will respond in kind by dumping all of its arsenal, everyone else is going to put its arsenal, and before you realize it, we're going to have a glowing Earth. And maybe that's what he wants. Maybe he wants to see if the Earth will glow in the nighttime without electric lights. The whole thing, of course, has only further destabilized the world economy. We're already dealing with a world coronavirus epidemic or pandemic. We're already dealing with interruption of services and trade and shipping and everything else. I mean, right now, in our local Walmart, we can't get cell phones. I mean, it sounds like a silly thing, but in our local Walmart, I went to help someone get a phone last night, and there was one phone on the shelf. I got the last phone on the shelf because the chips needed to make the phones can't be acquired because they're not being made. And there's part of the ones that have been made are in cargo ships sitting off the coast because there's not enough people to unload them. We have a huge problem with the world as it already exists. And now threats of war have just given big businesses an opportunity to gouge, to further restrict issues, to raise the concerns of war as being a cause. Keep in mind, this is not really actually based on real world shortages. Not yet. Give it a few years down the line, possibly, but definitely not yet. The shortages are in effect because the coronavirus issues and now things like oil and gas and wheat and other commodities are skyrocketing. They're skyrocketing in prices. Again, not because of actual shortages, but because people who see an opportunity to work off the fear of it are gouging the market. These spikes in inflation are more the results of the gouging than the real crisis. For example, Russian oil supplies, Russia supplies oil, this is like the third largest oil supplier in the world. That only constitutes about 10% of the world's oil. Other oil-bearing countries could easily step forward and fill that gap. It's not a crisis. It only provides roughly 6.5% of all U.S. oil. And guess what? We produce way more than enough to replace that if we could simply get the big oil companies to stop exporting all the oil they produce here and then buying it back at a cheaper rate so they can make money. And I've heard the argument that somehow we need to both export and import because it builds world security and blah, blah. This isn't the government's building world security. This is powerful companies doing this. It's an excuse. It's a justification. The truth is we should be supplying domestically our oil and gas needs before we export. But the big oil companies make more money by selling it overseas first than waiting for the prices to reach a level they can buy back in bulk for cheaper and less than they get paid for their exports. It's a profiteering angle. And it also gives the opportunity to justify charging more at the pump and to the retail consumer in the United States. There's absolutely no reason for this, but they gouge. They take the opportunity to do so. The U.S. could easily offset all of this by not exporting our oil. Hold our oil domestically. Hold it in place. Don't export it. Make a law. And yet, gas companies are already raising prices here when there's no actual shortage. In San Francisco, California, just this last Thursday, gas prices reached $5 a gallon. Now, I can't speak for the rest of the country or the rest of the world, but the United States is used to gas prices between the $2 and $3, $2.50 and $3 range right now. We've been up into about the $3.90 range for the last about year. Raising up slowly, inclining right now around $3.90. We've been raising our prices. Our prices have been going up because coronavirus issues, taxes, whatever. No need for it, just an opportunity to make money off of a highly demanded commodity. Now we're about $3.90 a gallon, and the prediction is that within a few weeks, even Montana could start seeing $5 a gallon. Just because, not because there's any actual shortages, not because there's a necessity to raise the price, but because big oil sees an opportunity to gouge. Big oil companies see an opportunity to make more money, to live off the fear, because people are afraid of it. People will go in and they'll pay it because they need it. Doesn't matter if it cripples the economy, doesn't matter if it cripples homes, it doesn't matter if it cripples people's ability to function in a normal society, because eventually the lack of income is going to catch up to the high prices and it's going to cause a crash. Not because there's a necessity of it, it's a false narrative, but it's going to cause a crash, it's going to cause a collapse. Because either people are going to rush to buy the gas and buy it out of the local stations, or it's going to lead to the point that people who are on low income can't afford the raising prices, they can't afford to go to work, and they're going to lose their jobs. It's going to cause a de-escalation of investment in the economy. At the end of the day, that's a very real concern. It's caused by the gouging from the oil companies. In 2005, New Orleans was shut down after Hurricane Katrina. Oil and gas companies tried to raise prices because their processing facilities were shut down. They tried to claim that because the processing center was shut down for gas, that there was going to be a national shortage, and as a consequence, that they needed to raise prices. Then President George W. Bush ordered a halt to the gouging, and he actually, it didn't have any real effect beyond the threat of it. He did, at the time, there were threats of sanctions, there were threats of penalties and fines if they continued to do so, and it did bring the gas prices down to a more moderate level at the time. And he did order the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, to investigate and fine any actual efforts to gouge based upon the crisis in New Orleans. Biden similarly has ordered, in present time, just this last week, has ordered the FTC to investigate gouging by big oil. Exports, the big oil companies, they export the vast majority of their product, and as a consequence, they have to buy back the product to actually fill the demand of the American market, when we actually produce a bulk of it here. In fact, we produce most of it here, if not all of it here, we could actually produce. But the big issue isn't solved by a law, isn't solved by anything that could actually be considered to be actual direct impact. It just, there needs to be laws to restrain these big companies to take advantage of it, but it's still the crisis that is behind it. This is mainly because it's more profitable to sell what's produced here high and then buy it back low and then pass any additional costs on to the American consumer. And because in our country, big oil companies, like every other major company, has lobbyists in the United States government and in Congress that are able to legally bribe our representatives to do what they want to do. Protect big oil, protect big tobacco, protect whatever the pharmaceuticals, whatever. In America, you can buy privilege. It's a broken concept. Probably need to do a podcast on lobbyists and how lobbyists impact. But nevertheless, it is an issue. But as I said, the real concern here, and I'm only talking about big oil as one example, and I probably got way too far off on that tangent, but the big issue here is the nuclear war. It's the fear that Putin has made. Well, anything else, any other subject would be a ridiculous posturing. I'm going to shoot a man on the street every day if I don't get my way. Okay, it's ridiculous posturing. Yeah, potentially people's lives could be lost, of course. But you're talking global war with nuclear arms that would literally has the potential of literally devastating the planet, wiping out human civilization as we know it. All because he wants to take one territory that he feels entitled to. And I said at the very beginning, he was after a wartime economy. He was trying to boost his economy through wartime efforts, and that's kind of backfired on him. But now the world has come together and sanctioned and locked down Russia. I mean, there's companies, big Fortune 500 companies, that are refusing to do business with Russia. This isn't just governments. This is businesses. Banks are shutting down and refusing to have associations. Many of the banks of Russia have been shut off from the SWIFT network, which deals with international monetary transactions. It's a huge deal. I don't think Putin was planning on this, but now he can't back down. He's been put in the position to where he either backs down and admits it and possibly suffers even more sanctions for years to come, or he pushes through and tries to somehow get something out of this. He's got to take Ukraine at this point, because if he doesn't, he's launched a massive attack. He's cost his own people lives. I mean, he's sent Russian troops in who have died, and then crippled, and in the process, crippled the Russian economy. So he's got to come out of this as a win somehow, and he can't lose face, and that's where we're at. His solution is, I'm going to threaten the world with world war, with nuclear annihilation. That's his solution. If I can't win, nobody's going to win. I will literally scorch the earth before I lose. I will go down blowing up everyone so I don't lose alone. And that's a really bad way to look at it, but that's what he's threatening. I grew up in the 70s and the 80s. As I mentioned, we lived in the fear of nuclear war. It was around since the 50s, since the Cold War started. The Cold War being the unofficial war where it started with East Berlin being taken and by Russian troops, and we started getting an Eastern Bloc of nations that became communist, and all of a sudden it was the democratic society versus the communist society, and the threat that Russia was going to bomb us any day. Propaganda fueled news and government information. It just hyped the belief of nuclear war with Russia was inevitable. It didn't happen. 91 came around, the Soviet Union collapsed. We started entering into diplomatic relations with Russia, and the former members of the Soviet Union, including Ukraine, and although the world still maintained their nuclear arsenals, no one was really talking about ever using them. In fact, we've gone out of our way to make sure no new power gains a nuclear weapon. The United Nations has their own committee that's designed to prevent other nations from developing nuclear technology so it doesn't become a global issue. In 91, with the fall of the Soviet Union, this fear went away. Until now. This isn't a podcast about America. It's not a podcast about the Great Montana Conspiracy. It's not a podcast about the corruption that exists within our country or within my state. This is about a fear factor that exists on an international scale. And I would think it would unite us all, whether you be a corrupt official or you be an honorable citizen, whether you serve in the military or you're just trying to survive day by day working a 40-hour job. This is an issue that should affect us all. And it should be a uniting issue, not a divisive issue. Because this literally hangs over our heads. All of us. My heart goes out, I hope in solidarity with the rest of my country, to the Ukrainian people. In the scope of literally another world war, even the Great Montana Conspiracy, it just feels small. And tonight I just could not do an episode talking about... I had an episode all planned for big money and corruption and buying influence within political elections. And I'll do that next week, I promise. But I just needed to take a break and talk about this because it was something that was on my mind. I'm sure it's on a lot of yours. And I hope that by speaking out, by trying to put some sense of history to it, maybe we can all come to an understanding that maybe in unity, maybe our goodwill, we can hope for the best. And I hope I'm here in the coming weeks to continue doing these podcasts. But like I said, this is a very real concern and it's not going to go away. I don't think tomorrow. I would like it to go away tomorrow. I don't think it's going to go away tomorrow. We're going to be with it for a little while. And if I need to take another break and talk about this some more, talk about something that's happened, I will. But please watch the news, watch the world events. If you're in a position, whether it be through government or big business or whatever else, to offer some support to Ukrainians, or the massive number of people who are now refugees outside their own country. As I recall, we just reached 1 million refugees who've left Ukraine trying to get away from the conflict, mostly women and children. Reach out, do your best. All I can do is provide information, but my heart goes out to the Ukrainian people and the horrific tragedy in life that they've been forced to endure. As always, as I end this podcast, again, if you are watching this, do like and subscribe. Take the time to share this video. This message possibly maybe not as important toward exposing the Great Montana Conspiracy as previous podcasts, but I still think it's important. So, once again, I do hope that anybody watching this video is safe, especially if you're watching this in Ukraine or any other area that might be affected by this war. But whenever possible, do be safe, and always, always, please be free. Thank you.